1. The war without meaning. They said the war was over. But no one realized that was exactly where it truly began. For 50 years, humanity lived under the shadow of an enemy that never explained its existence. There was no warning, no declaration, not even an attempt at contact. Just the first attack. It came from the edge of known space. A small colony. Remote. Almost irrelevant. Within minutes, all signals were gone. No distress call. No survivors. No answers. When rescue ships arrived, there was nothing left. No structures. No bodies. No signs of battle. It was as if the planet had been erased. At first, they called it a malfunction. Then a natural disaster. But then, it happened again and again. Entire colonies began disappearing from the star maps, one by one, like lights going out in a city at night. And then, they appeared. The silence. Not dramatically. No clear visuals. No threats. Only traces. Shadows on sensors. Movements that couldn't be tracked. Structures that seemed to exist, and not exist at the same time. Then came the direct attacks. Human fleets were destroyed in seconds. Defense systems failed before they could react. Fortified planets fell, like they never stood a chance. And the most terrifying part, they never spoke. No intercepted transmissions. No language patterns. No negotiation attempts. It was like fighting something that didn't just refuse to communicate, but didn't even acknowledge your existence. Over time, the war stopped being about winning. It became about surviving. Children grew up never knowing peace. Entire generations were raised on alarms, evacuations, and destruction reports. There was no front line. No clear strategy. No logic. Just chaos. And maybe that was the worst part. It wasn't just fear of death. It was fear of the unknown. Because deep down, one question remained. Why attack? Why destroy? Why stay silent? And the longer it went on, the more dangerous that question became. Because when there are no answers, imagination fills the void, and fear grows. But what no one knew back then was that the war had never truly been silent. Humanity just never knew how to listen. 2. The invisible enemy. If the war was terrifying, the enemy made it worse. Because no one knew what the silence really were. No clear images. No direct records. Only fragments. Broken reports. Distorted sensor readings. Conflicting survivor accounts. Some said they were made of light. Others swore they looked like living shadows. Some believed they had no physical form at all. But everyone agreed on one thing. They didn't behave like any known life form. They didn't fight like armies. No formations. No visible strategy. No detectable communication. And yet, everything was perfectly coordinated. Simultaneous attacks across systems. Movements impossible to predict. Decisions that seemed to anticipate every human response. As if they didn't need to speak, because they already knew. Scientists tried to explain it. A collective consciousness. A single mind spread across countless units. Others believed they existed outside human perception of time. But no theory was ever proven. And that made it worse. Because fighting something you don't understand is already hard. But fighting something that might not even follow the same rules of reality, that's terrifying. Soldiers began to fear something deeper than death. They feared not understanding. Systems failed before attacks. Weapons locked up without explanation. Ships were destroyed, without anyone seeing how. And the worst part was the silence. No commands. No signals. No response. Just emptiness. That's why they were called the Silence. Not because they made no sound, but because they never, ever spoke. And over time, that silence started to affect people. Psychologically, it felt like facing something that didn't hate you, didn't threaten you, just erased you, without emotion, without reason, and that created something worse than fear. Paranoia. What are they thinking? What do they want? Do they even see us as equals? Some began to believe. They didn't see humans as enemies at all, but as something lesser, something that needed to be corrected. And that's when the war changed. It stopped being just physical survival and became existential, because it wasn't just about living. It was about proving humanity deserved to exist. But what no one knew was that behind that silence, there was meaning, a pattern, a message, and somewhere hidden within it was the answer that could have stopped everything. 3. The man outside the war. In the middle of 50 years of chaos, one man didn't belong. Elias Varn. While billions fought to survive, he observed. No scars, no military background, just a diplomat. In a war with no dialogue. To most people, he was irrelevant. But Elias saw something others didn't. Patterns. Where others saw noise, he saw repetition. Where others saw coincidence, he saw intention. And that changed everything. Everyone believed one simple truth. The silence wanted humanity gone. End of story. But Elias couldn't accept that. Not out of hope, but out of logic. If they wanted extinction, why take so long? Why target some colonies and ignore others? Why repeat attack patterns with mathematical precision? That wasn't chaos. That was design. And that idea consumed him. Because if there was design, there was intention. And if there was intention, there was communication. Even if no one could see it. That belief isolated him. Ignored. Dismissed. But he kept going. Until one day, the chaos started making sense. The attacks weren't just attacks. They were signals. And for the first time in 50 years, someone was finally listening. 4. The discovery that changed everything. At first, it was just a theory. An unlikely idea. Almost absurd. But for Elias Varn, it was impossible to ignore. The patterns were there. Repeated. Precise. Too consistent to be random. He isolated himself for weeks. No contact. No real rest. No certainty anyone would ever believe him. But the more he analyzed, the clearer it became. The attacks followed sequences. Specific intervals. Calculated directions. Targets chosen with hidden logic. This wasn't chaos. It was structure. So Elias did something no one had ever done before. He stopped looking at the attacks as warfare, and started treating them as language. He turned trajectories into symbols, intervals into pauses, movements into syntax, like translating a message hidden inside destruction. At first, it didn't make sense. Fragments. Broken sequences. But he kept going, because deep down, he knew. This wasn't chaos. It was code. And then, it happened. A sequence repeated. Exactly the same. Same duration. Same structure. Same signature. That's when it became undeniable. It was intentional. Elias cross-referenced data across systems, across decades. And the result was clear. The silence were sending messages. Not through sound. Not through signals. But through war itself. Every attack, every movement, was part of something bigger. A language built from destruction. And in that moment, everything changed. Because if that was true, then 50 years of war had never been silence. Humanity just never understood the message. With shaking hands, Elias took the next step. The most dangerous one. He responded. Using the same patterns, the same logic, the same structure. A message built from what he had decoded. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. When the transmission was sent, no one knew what would happen. Some expected nothing. Others expected retaliation. Many believed it would trigger the end. Human fleets went into full alert. Weapons ready. Systems primed. And then, the universe answered. The silent ships stopped. They didn't retreat. They didn't attack. They didn't advance. They just froze, as if they were listening. The silence that followed was different. Not fear, not destruction, but anticipation. Seconds felt like hours. And then it came. A single transmission. Clear. Direct. They understood. And more than that, they were willing to respond. For the first time in 50 years, the war didn't move forward. It hesitated. And Elias Varn did something no one thought possible. He wasn't heard. He was understood. 5. The silence before peace. The entire universe felt suspended. After decades of war, something had changed. The silence didn't attack, didn't retreat, didn't react. They simply waited. And for human commanders, that wasn't relief. It was tension. Because in war, silence means one thing. Something is about to happen. Fleets held position. Weapons locked. Systems pushed to their limits. One wrong move, and everything would collapse again. But nothing happened. For the first time in decades, no one was fighting. No one was dying. They were waiting. And no one remembered how to do that anymore. Inside command centers, every signal was monitored. Any fluctuation could mean death. But there was nothing. Just that heavy silence. Dense. Almost alive. Elias watched without blinking. Because he knew. This wasn't emptiness. This was response. Hours passed. Then finally, a signal appeared. Not sound. Not visuals. Structure. Patterns. Organized. Intentional. Elias recognized it instantly. The same language. But now, complete. Clear. They were answering. His heart raced. One mistake, and the war would return instantly. Carefully, he decoded. Pattern by pattern. And then, it emerged. Simple. Direct. They accepted. Accepted contact. Accepted communication. Accepted negotiation. No one spoke. Because no one was ready for that. 50 years of war. And suddenly, the enemy wanted to talk. Some celebrated. Others suspected a trap. But Elias knew. There was no aggression. No urgency. No threat. Only intention. For the first time, the silence weren't attacking. They were communicating. And without firing a shot, Elias Varn had done the impossible. He created a pause in the war. But what no one understood yet was that this pause was not the end. It was only the beginning. 6. The truth revealed. First contact wasn't what anyone expected. There were no words, no faces, no conversation, as humans understand it. Only understanding. Elias was the only one who could bridge that gap. Because he was the only one who truly listened. The silence didn't communicate in sentences. They transmitted entire ideas at once. Complex structures of meaning. Like trying to understand a thought in a language you were never taught. At first, it was overwhelming. Every response took hours, sometimes days. But gradually, it made sense. And then came the truth. The silence were not at war out of hatred. They were following a directive. A purpose. They showed records. Civilizations. Species. Worlds. All following the same pattern. Growth. Expansion. Consumption. And eventually, instability. Some collapsed. Others became threats. Threats that spread. Destroyed everything around them. The silence weren't conquerors. They were observers. And when necessary, interveners. Humanity wasn't special. Just the next case. The data was clear. Humanity was following the same path. And not toward a good future. The war was never aggression. It was containment. An attempt to stop something before it became unstoppable. Elias had no answer. Because for the first time, he couldn't deny it. Humanity might not be the victim. It might be the problem. But there was more. The silence didn't want extinction. If they did, it would already be over. They were limiting, controlling, containing, like holding back a fire before it spreads. And then came the offer. If humanity limited its expansion, the war would end. Immediately. No more death. No more destruction. Peace. But not victory. Containment. And for the first time, a dangerous question appeared. What if they're right? 7. The peace treaty. The offer hung in the air, like salvation or a sentence. The end of war. After 50 years, humanity had a choice. But it came with a cost. Not territory, not technology, but limitation. The silence didn't want control over humans. They wanted control over their future. Expansion would stop. Growth would be restricted. Humanity would be contained. Many leaders rejected it immediately. This isn't peace. It's a cage. Debates exploded. But there was one problem. The war was being lost. And for the first time, there was a way out. Elias stood at the center. The only one who understood both sides. The only one who knew. This wasn't a trap. After days without sleep, he made his decision. He accepted. Because without it, humanity might not survive. And so, the treaty was created. Carefully structured. Fragile. Historic. The war was over. Or so everyone believed. But deep down, Elias still had one question. What if this is a mistake? 8. The hero of humanity. The news spread across the galaxy faster than the war ever did. The war was over. After 50 years of fear, sirens, evacuations, and unimaginable loss, silence finally meant something different. It meant peace. On Earth, entire cities stopped. People stepped outside, unsure how to react. Some cried. Some laughed. Many just looked at the sky. Without fear. For the first time in generations, tomorrow didn't feel dangerous. Families reunited. Soldiers returned home. Children would grow up without learning the sound of war before they learned how to speak. It was the end of an era. And at the center of it all was one name. Elias Varn. He wasn't just recognized. He was celebrated. A savior. A visionary. The man who did the impossible. Monuments were planned. Speeches were written. His story became a symbol of hope. The man who didn't fight, but won. To most people, Elias represented something powerful. That intelligence could defeat violence. That reason could overcome chaos. That peace was still possible. But not everyone believed that. Behind the scenes, there was doubt. Generals who had spent their lives fighting didn't trust such sudden peace. Politicians feared the consequences of limitation. Scientists questioned the cost of halted progress. And one question lingered. What if we're being controlled? But those voices were drowned out by celebration. Because after so much suffering, no one wanted to question peace. No one wanted to go back. Elias knew that. He walked through crowds that admired him. He heard gratitude in every voice. But inside, something wasn't right. Because unlike everyone else, Elias knew the full truth. He knew what the silence believed about humanity, what they feared, what they predicted. And more than anything, he knew that this peace was not freedom. It was containment, an invisible leash placed on all of humanity. And with every celebration, that feeling grew stronger inside him. Because while the world saw salvation, Elias saw limitation. A stagnant future. A controlled future. And for the first time, a dangerous thought formed. What if this is wrong? What if humanity wasn't saved, but stopped? What if the war should never have ended? And in that moment, in the middle of the greatest celebration in human history, the real conflict began. Inside him. 9. The choice no one saw. The celebrations echoed across the world. But Elias Varn wasn't listening anymore. while billions celebrated the end of war. He stood in silence, not watching the sky, not watching the people, but watching the future. Because unlike everyone else, he understood what peace truly meant. It wasn't freedom. It never was. It was a limit, an invisible line humanity would never be allowed to cross again. At first, it seemed fair. Billions of lives saved, in exchange for controlled expansion. But the more he thought about it, the more it disturbed him. Because this wasn't just a political decision. It was a shift in destiny. Humanity would no longer choose its path. It would be guided, contained, controlled. And the question grew louder inside him. What if this is the beginning of the end? What if, by accepting peace, humanity was giving up everything that made it strong? Elias revisited the data, the patterns, the predictions, the fallen civilizations. It all made sense, but something didn't sit right. The silence weren't just preventing destruction. They were deciding who gets to evolve. And to Elias, that was unacceptable, because he believed something different. He believed conflict drives evolution, that humanity became what it is, because it struggled, because it fought, because it survived. Without war, without risk, without threat, what would remain? A stable civilization, yes, but also predictable, limited, weak. And then, the thought became certainty. What if peace is the real danger? That night, alone in his chamber, Elias looked at the treaty again, the document that would save humanity, or cage it. His eyes scanned every clause, every line, every detail, until he found it. A flaw, small, almost invisible, a point in the security protocols, where failure could happen, naturally, gradually, inevitably. And in that moment, Elias made the most important choice in human history. Accept peace, or ensure it would never last. For a brief second, he hesitated, because he knew what it meant. More war, more death, more suffering, but also more evolution, more strength, more survival. And then, he chose, with steady hands and complete awareness. Elias Varn altered the treaty. One change, small enough to go unnoticed, big enough to destroy everything. He planted the flaw, a condition that would, sooner or later, lead to inevitable conflict. And when he finished, there was no hesitation, no regret, no doubt, only certainty. In that moment, the man who saved humanity ceased to exist, and something else was born. Someone who believed billions could die, if it meant securing the future of the species. The architect of a war that should never end. And the most terrifying part, no one saw it. 10. The birth of the true villain. At first, no one noticed. The treaty was signed. The war ended. And for a brief, almost forgotten moment, there was peace. Weapons fell silent. Fleets withdrew. Broken systems began to rebuild. Humanity breathed again. But peace was fragile. And Elias knew it. Days passed. Then weeks. And then, it happened. A small error. A patrol ship deviated. A defense system reacted. A protocol failed. Something simple. Something believable. But enough. The silence responded. Not with words. Not with warning. But with action. One ship destroyed. That was all it took. Panic returned. They broke the treaty. It was an attack. They never wanted peace. On the other side, the silence saw something different. To them, humanity failed. And just like that, trust collapsed. Not with a massive event, but with a small detail. Exactly as Elias had planned. The war returned. But this time, it wasn't about the unknown. It was about betrayal. And that made it worse. Faster. More brutal. More unforgiving. Because now, No one believed in peace anymore. And Elias, he watched. Not as a leader, not as a hero, but as an observer. Because this wasn't chaos. It was outcome. Exactly as he predicted. From the shadows, he moved. Adjusting information. Shaping perception. Feeding fear on both sides. Ensuring every conflict escalated. Every mistake looked intentional. Every chance for peace died before it began. He didn't command armies. He controlled the narrative. And that was more powerful than any weapon. Over time, his name faded. Not forgotten. Hidden. Elias Varn was no longer the visible hero, but the invisible force behind the war. An architect. A man who didn't fight, but decided who would. And why? Because to him, humanity needed this. Needed pressure. Needed conflict. Needed constant danger. To evolve. To survive. No matter the cost. And in the end, when future generations looked back, trying to understand why the war never ended, they would search for answers in the stars. In aliens. In history. In mistakes. But they would never find the full truth. Because humanity's greatest enemy didn't come from another world. Didn't speak an unknown language. Didn't look alien. He was human. He thought like a human. And he believed. He was right. Elias Varn. The man who saved humanity. Only to condemn it. To an eternal war.